Thanks. Looks like everyone's sound is working. Brian, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much. And hello, everybody. It's great to see so many familiar names in our chat today as we dive back into our series of training for the 2020 RSVP competition. I'll pick up kind of where we just left off. I see that many of you have already done this. You're getting the run of show here. But in case you already haven't, just go ahead and take a minute and introduce yourself in that chat box there. We can actually already see your names. There's no need to type your name. But if you could just go ahead and type in your organization name and the city and state that you're joining in. I like to get people warmed up using that chat box because that is how we will take questions here today. All lines will stay on mute as we just heard, but you can put questions in that chat box at any time. Just know I may wait until the right moment to take those questions depending on where we are in the content. There are also a couple of kinds of questions that, as many of you will know by now from having attended our other trainings, we may not be able to answer here today. First, if I just don't have the information handy, or if the question is very, very specific and unique to your organization and would require a lot of explanation and back and forth, I won't be able to answer that here today, just because we want to make sure that everybody, it looks like we've got about 70 learners here today, we want to make sure they all get the information that they're looking for. So if you have one of those kinds of questions, you can send it to us via email, and if you look down in that Senior Core Resources box to the bottom right, all the way at the bottom of that list, you will see something that says questions with a question mark. Go ahead and click on that, and that'll take you to our email address for this competition, 2020RSVP@cns.gov, 2020RSVP@cns.gov. But again, you don't need to remember that because you can get to it through that link down there. In addition, there are some questions that neither myself nor the email box will be able to answer. And those are questions that coach you through or that provide individualized assistance into your application. This is a competitive process. We want to make sure everybody has a fair and equal opportunity to get a grant through that process. So we're not able to provide individual advice in that kind of way. A couple other preliminaries to get through before we really do get into the meat of the content here today. And one is actually in direct response to Marlene's question that I see in the chat box. Marlene asked, before we start, I missed the last session. Where can I go to get the information? Well, Marlene, you've got a couple of different options. As we already heard, all of these sessions are being recorded. The recordings are not yet up on the 2020 RSVP competition page, but they should be soon. We just finished processing all of last week's recordings, and then you can expect this week's recordings to be up probably by early next week. And if you want to go to that page, you can get to it both by that link you see on the screen, and if you look down the bottom right again, that Senior Core Resource Links box, the very top one will take you to that page. Again, you won't see any recordings there just yet, but they should appear soon from last week, so those first 3 sessions. That's one way you can get the information. The other way you can get the information is, as you might be able to tell by the schedule that we've got on the screen now, is you can come on back and get it live, because all of these sessions are offered twice. That's right, we are repeating everything one full time through. So you can come back and hear it live again from the exact same content. So if you already attended one, you might not get a whole lot out of the second one, but you can, if you can attend if you missed it, ask some questions that maybe you didn't have a chance to ask before. All the detailed information for those is on that link that you see at the bottom of the screen. Okay, finally, before we do dive into today's content, we like to get a feel for who is in the room, and if I could ask the LSI team to go ahead and pull up our first poll. Let's see how many folks have worked with a federal grant before, including one from CNCS. We'll see if these results are consistent with our other webinars. Okay, with a fair percentage of the audience in reporting, it looks like we've got a lot of experience with federal grants before. And that is always, I think, a positive sign. We're going to talk today about national performance measures, our system of performance measurement. But if you've worked with another federal agency, my guess is you've worked with performance measurement in one way, shape, or form. Okay, Elsa, let's go ahead and put the second poll up there. How well do you know Senior Corps? Have you worked with us before, the Corporation for National and Community Service? Or are you brand new to all of this? Is this your first entry? This is one of my favorite times of the year because I get to introduce so many new people to the national service community, this vibrant community of organizations, leveraging the best in civic engagement for their communities, and at the same time, spotlight the tremendous impact that has already been made and reaffirm that partnership with so many of our prior grantees. Looks like we've got mostly familiar faces here today. You all are welcome. Some of this information, of course, will probably be a review to you, but it's always good to get a little bit of a refresher and learn about the specifics of this competition. Let's go ahead and get our next question up. One of the wonderful things about the national service community, and Senior Corps specifically, is how diverse it is. So I like to see where people think their major focus is. Now, we know most organizations probably would describe themselves in more than one way of the options that you see on the screen here, but go ahead and let us know the one that you think best describes the field of your organization. Again, knowing that that's probably a little bit of a simplification. Interestingly, know something else so far today. Usually we get a couple of those, and it looks like most of the responses are hovering up towards the top of the screen there with aging, volunteerism, and community development coming in below that. Okay, and now let's go ahead and just skip to our last question and see who has been with us before in one of our webinars in this series. I do see a lot of familiar faces, but it's always nice to check and see if there is anyone new. I think we already know from the chat box that there's at least one person who's new. Okay, we got a couple. That's great. Welcome. Glad you're able to join us for this session. Like I said, if you weren't able to attend any of our prior sessions, that is okay. You can view a recording of the training, which should be available very soon on that competition webpage, or come back. And even if the information is out of order a little bit, it should still roughly all hang together. It should all make sense. We want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to get the information they need to apply. All right, thanks, Alice. I appreciate your help with that. So today we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to spotlight some competition basics, and that's what we'll do first. And then we'll look at national performance measures specifically. For those of you who have attended several of our, or any of our other webinars, will know that we really haven't been able to get through one without talking about performance measurement and national performance measures, at least a little bit in all of them, right? It kind of runs through everything. But usually I've said something to the effect of, well, we can talk about this a little bit here, and then we'll revisit it in more depth later on. Well, now is later on. So that's where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. And for those of you who are new, I realize you may be looking for some other information here, but just know we're only going to provide a little bit of information about the competition as a whole, including where to get more information, so that we can focus on that second piece. It's a really important piece. I would say it's probably the most complex piece of managing a Senior Corps grant, so I really do want to give it the time it deserves. To cover some of our basics, you can see a lot of the important information on the screen right now. Applications are due at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on September 25th. We have an optional notice of intent to apply process. That is completely optional, but we encourage it. It helps us know how many applications to expect, so we're ready for what comes in. And all of the information you need is at that website you see on the screen right now. That is also available. It's the top link in the Senior Corps resource links box to the bottom right. That is your headquarters. That is where to go first for any questions you have. And probably the most important document there is called the Notice of Funding Opportunity. It's our equivalent of a request for applications or request for proposals. It spells out the competition rules and processes, our evaluation criteria, lots of other important information. This competition is geographically limited, and you can find the geographic service areas that are available in a document called Appendix A. That is Appendix A to the Notice of Funding Opportunity. It's also available in the 2020 RSVP competition homepage. And in addition to that tool, we've got lots of other tools, some of which we'll be talking about quite a bit here. We already talked about the NOFO. That's our equivalent to a request for applications or request for proposals. Next is the RSVP grant application instructions, and that is a step-by-step guide to navigating our electronic grants management system. Appendix A lists all of the available service areas, and as many of you probably know by now, the associated funding amount of that service area and the minimum number of unduplicated volunteers required. We compete those three things as a package. So you apply to serve a specific area. As you apply to serve that specific area, there is a maximum amount of funding that you can request to serve that specific area, and a minimum number of unduplicated volunteers you need to maintain. We'll talk a little bit more about that minimum number of unduplicated volunteers later on in this webinar. Appendix B and the work plan development worksheets we're going to talk a lot about today, and you could probably tell that from the descriptions. And then finally, there is the frequently asked questions. So that gets our basics out of the way. I can take just a couple of minutes to answer some of those higher level questions about the competition basics, but only a couple minutes because I do want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk about the agenda here today. Okay, I see Carol started us off. With the transformation plan underway, who will be reviewing our applications? Is the process the same prior to the transformation plan? So for those of you who don't know, CNCS is in the process of implementing a transformation and sustainability plan. I am going to share a URL that tells you all about that in case you want to learn more about it. And the review process is spelled out in the notice of funding applications. What it says there when you go and look at it is that these applications go through a blended review, which means we have both CNCS staff and external reviewers who collaborate to review applications. Again, that is described in more depth in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. There's a whole section on the review process. So if you want to learn more about that, you can review that. But it is a blended review, and has been, that's not anything new for us, of both CNCS staff and external reviewers. Okay, Laura asks, will the minimum number of volunteers be held for year 1 of grant or by the end of year 3? And so, Laura, we evaluate performance at the end of year 3. Of course, we hope that our applicants are striving to reach those levels from the very beginning, but we know sometimes it takes some time to ramp up. So we evaluate performance at the end of year 3 of grants. And I can take one more before we move on to the bulk of our content here today. Okay, Mary Newton asks, is there a limit on the number of community needs submittals? Also, is there a max number of pages for each community needs narrative to be? So we'll look at where you describe the community need in a couple different ways. Let me just check something briefly to make sure I don't misspeak as I double check something in my documentation here. Okay, you're going to address that to a certain extent in the strengthening community section of your narrative as well as your work plan. So those are two different parts of the application. We'll look in particular at the work plan part here today, but do know that there's also that strengthening community section in the application, and that is described more in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. There is not a page limit, but there is a character limit. Unfortunately, I don't have that specific number with me here today. I can, however, tell you where I would look to find that, which is the FAQs or the grant application instructions. It's the FAQs or the grant application instructions for the character limit for that particular section of the work plans. If it's not there, of course, you can always email 2020RSVP@cns.gov for more information. There is no maximum number of community needs you are serving. That usually gets translated into specific work plans, and there's no maximum on the number of work plans that you need to submit, no maximum or minimum. That we will talk about a little bit here today. I'm just going to give a quick announcement to my colleagues over at LSI team, just to let you know, I just had my internet connection flicker off and back on. Everything seems to be okay with me, but please let me know if there are any disruptions on your end. Thanks for that help, LSI team. But with those questions out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into the meat of our agenda here today. we will be talking about national performance measures. We're going to start by going over sort of the highest level, what are they and why do we do them? Then we'll look at work plans, the specific part of an application, and how to allocate volunteers across work plans. Finally, we'll talk about volunteers that might not show up in one of your national performance measure work plans. Let's dive in. And I'm going to start with a question for all of you. Why measure performance? Why do we measure performance at all here? Why is CNCS, the agency I work for, the Corporation for National Community Service, the agency that is making these funds available, so interested in performance measurement? And this is a real question. Go ahead and offer some ideas in the chat box there. Y'all were warming that up for a reason. Let's use it. Let's suggest some things. For those of you who've never met me, I like to use this picture at this time because I actually look a little bit like this guy. I am probably a little older, a little grayer, but it's not a terrible likeness of me. So let's see what suggestions we get here. Robert says it's about the effectiveness of the grant, and Leah seconds that with impact. Kelly mentions accountability to taxpayers. Right, we are a federal program. You all are our bosses. And as a result of that, you all are also paying for these funds in the end through your taxpayer dollars. And it looks like some other responses are coming in, sort of variations on that theme, either looking at impact or accountability. And that's a pretty good summary. We really do take this responsibility seriously. We are all stewards of taxpayer dollars here at the Corporation for National and Community Service. And if you receive an RSVP grant, you become a steward of taxpayer dollars as well. And that comes with certain responsibilities, including the responsibility to assess your impact, to let us know how you're doing, and to hopefully improve, right? To use that information to make the greatest impact you can. So why do we measure performance? It's those things that we just talked about. Accountability and improvement. It also helps us identify things that can be replicated or scaled up or done elsewhere. We're in a really special position here because I get to work with grantees and applicants from all across the country. And when someone is doing something really outstanding, it can be measured and shown to be outstanding. Well, why wouldn't we look to do that in other places? It's also an important part of how we tell our story of service, right? The national performance measures, the system of measurement we're about to talk about, are a unified system. And that lets us take the impact of an RSVP grantee in New Hampshire, let's say, and add it to the impact of an RSVP grantee in Arizona, and add it to the impact of an RSVP grantee in Washington State. And in fact, because we do use the same system, it also lets us add that impact to our colleagues in service in the AmeriCorps program, another program run by the Corporation for National and Community Service. So that's why we measure performance, and that's why it's so important. Now, as I already alluded to, the specific system we use to do that is called the National Performance Measures. They're a uniform set of measures, so we're going to look at a menu of measures, and everybody in the national service community uses some version of those measures. That allows us to measure and assess your effectiveness and communicate it, and it also supports that unified story of service. They are made up of a number of different components. And we're going to walk through all of the different components of a performance measure in our parlance. It's kind of like a pyramid in that they start off pretty broad down here at the bottom with the focus area, and then they get more specific as you go up that pyramid. So let's talk about what each one of these means, and we're going to start down here at focus area. There are 6 CNCS focus areas, and then we also talk about a key goal of capacity building. Those focus areas are disaster services, economic opportunity, education, environmental stewardship, healthy futures, and veterans and military families. Those were actually included in our most recent reauthorization legislation, which means that the U.S. Congress told CNCS, we need you to focus on these 6 critical areas. They said that in that law, and that means we need to do that. And as we'll see, every RSVP grant needs to have activity in at least one of those focus areas. You can also tell they're pretty broad, right? You can do lots of different things in the category of healthy futures or education. And the objective makes that just a little bit more specific. It's a general category within each focus area. So up top here, you can see economic opportunity, which is pretty broad. is translated into 3 slightly more specific objectives: financial literacy, housing, and employment. So we're getting a little bit more concrete in terms of the specific kind of activity that is going on, but they're still pretty broad, right? You could still do lots of different things in the field of employment and call it employment. And now we get to the specific measures. Those are reflected in outputs and outcomes. The way I like to differentiate between these two is an output is like a seed that you plant. An outcome is the plant that flowers from that seed, right? You are going to work with a certain number of individuals, but most likely, most of the time, not all of those individuals are actually going to achieve the social outcome that you're looking for, right? We here in the social services rarely get that 100% success rate where we're trying to move someone into a new way of life or create some kind of change, right? So the people we work with, and I say people, it doesn't have to always be people. You'll see some outputs that reflect things like homes or miles, but by and large, it'll be people. That's the output. And then the number of people who experience, jump beyond that, the number of people who experience that change is the outcome. So the output, number of individuals served, outcome, number of individuals with improved financial knowledge. And when we add all those things together, that is a performance measure. That is a performance measure. We're going to take a look at our national performance measures in just a minute. But first, I want to go over some key terms. The first is a national performance measure work plan. So a work plan is a specific part of the application. It's structured. It's kind of like a table. It actually mimics what some of you may know as a logical framework or a logic model. That's a work plan. And there are 2 kinds of work plans. And the first one, the most important one, is a national performance measure work plan. So you might hear me use that term. That is any work plan that results in an output and an outcome. Any work plan that has these kinds of measures associated with it, right? That results in these measures. Next is unduplicated volunteer. That is one individual person included in one specific work plan. When counting unduplicated volunteers, each volunteer can be counted only once if they are assigned, even if they are assigned to more than one service activity. The volunteer should be counted in the area where he or she will make the most impact in terms of the focus area, the type of service, or the scope of service. So many of you will probably have volunteers who do more than one kind of activity, right? They might work at a food pantry some days and do food delivery some other days. Or they might do things even more different than that. They might work at a food pantry some days and do volunteer income tax assistance some other days or a different time of year. For the purposes of national performance measures, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about unduplicated volunteers, which just means you need to take that one person and identify where you think he or she is making the greatest impact, and you're going to assign them to that activity. There's a place to capture all of their activity, so you'll include that too. You'll let us know that they're working in 2 places too, but we need you to tell us where they are spending the most time. So let's do an example just to work through this. Cleo volunteers with Alexandria RSVP in 2 programs. She volunteers at least twice a week in a food pantry. She also provides periodic, infrequent consulting services to local organizations based on her prior career in accounting. Would Cleo, and this is a question for all of you, please answer in the chat box, would Cleo be counted as an unduplicated volunteer in Healthy Futures work plan focusing on her work in the food pantry, a capacity building work plan focusing on her consulting work, or both? Please suggest some answers there in the chat box. Okay, it seems like the consensus is focusing on that food pantry. Susan really gets to the most important thing, which is that both is completely wrong. You could maybe construct a scenario where it might still be possible for her to focus on the capacity building side of things if you really thought that that was where she was making the greatest impact, but it doesn't really sound that way. It sounds like Healthy Futures is probably more where she is making the greatest impact. And the most important thing to know, is that it's not going to be both, right? That's the one that it will definitely not be. Not both. Okay. One more term to discuss. I'm going to step back just a little bit. Other community priorities. right? That is a work plan. That's the other kind of work plan, right? So two kinds of work plans. National performance measures is one kind of work plan. Other community priorities is a second kind of work plan. And that is a work plan that does not result in an output or an outcome. It doesn't result in any of that measurable activity. And essentially, it's a big catch-all category. You include all of the activity that can't be included in national performance measure outputs or outcomes in this other community priorities box. And we'll look at an example to see how that works. Okay. The key tools that we'll use for this are Appendix B, our National Performance Measure instructions, and the Work Plan Development worksheets. And I'm going to go ahead and navigate to the National Performance Measure instructions now. To get to them, you can follow that 2020 RSVP competition homepage link, right? This is the page where I said all of our key information is going to be. So I am here on that page now. I go down, here's that one first super important document I mentioned, the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And then Appendix B to that is the National Performance Measure instructions. And we're going to go ahead and take a quick look at that. This includes all of our performance measures, right? The national performance measures are like a menu. And you're going to select the measures that best describe what you do. As you'll see, they are organized in terms of our focus areas, right? These should look pretty familiar to all of you. They're organized in terms of our focus areas. We do have some instructions at the beginning. I'll essentially be giving you all of this information right now. So this is where you can go to learn about it in more depth. And then we've got a little summary section here that shows you an objective with all of its associated outputs and outcomes in a graphical way. This summarizes the information that comes down later in the document. I'm going to jump ahead to show you what it looks like. Let's go to like the economic opportunity. Here we go. The economic opportunity focus area. So here's the section on this particular focus area. And what you'll see when you go down is it's got specific outputs, and then it defines some key terms and suggests how they should be measured or collected. So it's more than a suggestion, to be honest with you. It is how they should be measured or collected. But you'll see it's pretty high level. It gives you a pretty wide bandwidth for what you can do to measure or collect these different measures. It has both the outputs and the outcomes spelled out here. And again, if you want to see them all together, you can go back up in the document to this little summary chart that will show you all of the available outputs and outcomes in this particular focus area. You can also see that they're tied to specific objectives, again, mimicking that pyramid that we looked at before. So that's where you go to find the specific performance measures. I'm also just going to take a minute to highlight this, our work plan development worksheets, because those are really, really important tools. And we'll do that back in our presentation here. So those look like this. This is actually a screenshot from those work plan development worksheets. Now, work plans are a specific part of the electronic grants management system, a specific part of your application, and they're built, they're structured, they're constructed. It's not a narrative, not just a blank space for you to write what you want. Instead, you need to provide this specific information and fill out these specific columns. It looks a little bit different within the electronic grants management system, but this is all the information that it asks for. And we'll go through these in some depth. But the key thing is if you want to experiment, if you want to try to fill some out, you're going to want to use this worksheet rather than the system itself. eGrants is a really great piece of software in some ways, but it can also be a little bit clunky. And one thing it doesn't do well is it doesn't allow for experimentation. It doesn't allow for multiple drafts very well. So you're going to want to use this work plan development worksheet. Okay, now we're going to start to just get a little bit more applied and look at how you can actually start to translate some of your work, and specifically how you will allocate unduplicated volunteers, a very important part of the process. But we've got an opportunity here to learn a little bit more about all of you once again. Go ahead, LSI, please, if you could, and bring the poll that goes along with the slide up. And let's learn about which of the focus areas or capacity building do you expect to include in your application. And you can choose more than one option here, by the way. Just like you can submit more than one work plan with your application. And in fact, most applicants don't do that. Or sorry, most applicants do that. Most applicants do submit more than one application. So go ahead and fill that out. Let's get a sense of the spread in our community. By the way, this is not binding. This is just for our information, just so we can see. And we've got that characteristic diversity that we're used to seeing in the senior corps community. It does look like almost everybody that we've got here today, at least let's answer the question, will have some activity in healthy futures, but lots of other areas as well. Looks like the second most popular one is education, followed by economic opportunity. And this is not terribly different than what we see in the senior corps community writ large. So thank you for that. Okay, LSI team, you can go ahead and move that poll out. Okay, now let's talk about allocating your volunteers. So there is a specific requirement in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, and I'm actually going to navigate us there so that we can see it together. We're back on the home page. I'm going to check out the Notice of Funding Opportunity. I already have that open right here, and I am going to go up higher in the document to a section that talks about national performance measures. And this says, this funding opportunity requires applicants to demonstrate cost-effective practices in achieving performance goals through the service described in the proposed work plans. Applicants must include work plans that meet the following minimum requirements. Work plans, when combined, must, at a minimum, include the total number of unduplicated volunteers listed in Appendix A for the geographic service area affected. We already talked about that just a little bit, right? When you apply for an application, or when you apply for a service area, there's a specific number of unduplicated volunteers that you need to include in your application for that specific service area. And then the second thing it says, for every $1,000 in annual base federal funding, at least one unduplicated volunteer must be placed in work plans that result in national performance measure outcomes. So we've got this other minimum number of unduplicated volunteers, and this one ties to performance measures. So how do those things interact? How do those things interact? Okay, we've got these two things. One, our total number of unduplicated volunteers included in Appendix A. And the second is the number of unduplicated volunteers in our National Performance Measure work plans. And for that, we need one unduplicated volunteer for every dollar in annual federal funding you receive. So we've got here what looks like an excerpt from our Appendix A. If you haven't looked at Appendix A yet, this is very much like what you will see there. It has a state, an opportunity number, a total amount of funding available, a number of unduplicated volunteers, and the service area that would be affected. So let's apply these two things to this service area and see how they shake out. Well, first, our application needs to have the total number of unduplicated volunteers stated in Appendix A. That is this column, number of unduplicated volunteers. So that means an organization applying to serve Montague and Capulet counties in the state of Verona needs to include at least 150 unduplicated volunteers in their application in total, 150 unduplicated volunteers. Second, they're going to need to take this $125,000, the amount of funding available, and divide it by 1,000. That produces, luckily, some easy math, 125. And that's the number they need to have in the national performance measures, right? So you need to have 150 total volunteers, and you need to measure the performance of at least 125. That's how those two numbers interact. That's how those two numbers interact. So this one's going to be smaller than this one, or equal to, smaller or equal to. So let me step back a little bit. Here we go. What we need to do is we need to allocate these volunteers across our work plan. And the first thing you do is identify how many unduplicated volunteers must be programmed into those National Performance Measure work plans. That's what we just did, right? That's what we just did. That's that 125 number right there. You take your annual federal funding and divide it by 1,000. That is how you identify the total amount of unduplicated volunteers you need to program into National Performance Measure work plans, right? That little bit of math. Now we allocate them across our work plans. Well, what does that mean? Well, back to our work plan development worksheet. And as you'll see, for each work plan you include in your application, you're going to need to tell us the number of unduplicated volunteers. You're going to fill out a different work plan for each set of performance measures that you use. And as I said, there's no minimum or maximum. The minimum is 1, but below that, there's no minimum or maximum that you will need to include. So for every set of performance measures you intend to use, you'll need to include one of these. And for each of them, you will assign a certain number of unduplicated volunteers. You need to assign a certain number of unduplicated volunteers to that work plan. And when you add them all up, in this example, you need to get that 125. We'll look at how you can include that last 25 for this example that gets you to that total number of unduplicated volunteers. So here we have a work plan that's partially full. We're working within our example of Montague and Capulet counties. And this particular applicant is focusing, it looks like, on healthy futures, right? So they've chosen that focus area of healthy futures. And they've also gone ahead and chosen their objective of aging in place. That is one of those more specific objectives within the focus area of healthy futures. And we see here some of the information that we saw on that worksheet. Their service activity, the number of unduplicated volunteers, the number of total volunteers, the number of stations, the output target, the outcome target, the outcome and the outcome target. Now this is the first time we're really looking in depth at column E, number of total volunteers. I'm actually going to invite the chat. Can anyone in the chat tell me what is going on in column E? What are we trying to say when we're asking about total volunteers as opposed to column D? What is the difference between these two columns? Can anybody in the chat tell me that? What is the difference between these two columns? Right, okay, I see Alyssa and Trista are the fastest typers, and a lot of people are filling in behind them. Right, you can have some volunteers show up in this 95 that will also show up down here. You can't have volunteers show up in the 75 that also show up down here, right? They can only show up in one work plan as an unduplicated volunteer, but they can show up in multiple work plans as a total volunteer, and that makes sense. So if we're working with our example of Montague and Capulet counties, remember, they needed to have 125 unduplicated volunteers in National Performance Measure work plans. If these were all the work plans they were submitting, they were just doing two, they're focusing only on healthy futures, what number would we expect to show up down here in column D? What number would we expect to show up down there in column D? $50, right? And that's because 50 plus 75 equals 125, right? That's that math that we just did. 50 plus 75 equals 125. Note that they could have more work plans. We simplified the example here to just have two, and they could have them in other focus areas. Could have an education work plan, could have a capacity building work plan, right? We're just focusing a little bit here to keep the examples simple. Now, we don't actually have enough information to know how many total volunteers they'll have. But we do know it's going to be bigger than that number, right? Because it'll include at least all of those 50, plus anyone who might be included in that 75 who is serving in both. So we don't really know exactly what that number will be. Let's just go ahead and say that it's 75. And Mary, hopefully that answers your question. Are unduplicated also to be counted in number of total volunteers? Yes. Yes, they should be. That's absolutely right. Okay, now we come to our targets in columns G and J. Can anybody tell me in columns G and J, how would we get those numbers? Where do those numbers come from? How do we get our output and outcome targets? Okay, Marge says surveys. And that's that's a piece of the puzzle. Robert says assessments. Anyone else? Allison says drop-down boxes that tie to objectives for outcomes. Carol says clients served. Okay, we're on the right track here. So to the drop-downs are really going to come out when you pick your specific outputs, right? So the specific outputs and outcomes, those will be drop-downs based on the objectives. But when it comes to the actual numbers, right, this is where we say how many people we expect to show up here, how many people we expect to be able to count. Those of you who said surveys or assessments are on the right track, right, but those are all looking backwards. So you can probably use those if you've been doing this kind of work, right, and you can draw from your historical experience. But Tracy's got a good suggestion if you're looking forward. Talk to the stations, right, talk to community members to understand what you can expect. There is no cut and set dry formula. There is no, magical potion that we can give you to get those numbers, right? It's going to be very much based on your community, your program, and your stations. So that's how you get them, because they are forward-looking. Of course, again, if you have been doing that work in the past, things like tracking documents from stations, surveys, that's all going to be very helpful to you as you project forward. But at this stage, this is an application. These are targets, right? So we are talking about what you expect to achieve over the coming year. This is just another very simple example, just to emphasize that you could, in fact, include multiple work plans in multiple focus areas. Many applicants do that. That is completely okay. I just didn't want to have only one example in here that only dealt with individual focus areas. Now let's talk a little bit more about other community priorities. That's that catch-all category for activities that do not fall within national performance measures. It does not include any output or outcome measures. Instead, it's just a simple question: did you meet your own targets? That does count towards your total number of unduplicated volunteers, and it does not count towards your national performance measure requirements. So let's go back to our example of Montague and Capulet counties. We already know that these are going to add up to 125. Does anyone remember how many unduplicated volunteers they would need to show up in column D for their other community priorities work plan to have an eligible application for this particular service area? Can anybody tell us what's going to show up in column D there? Okay, Melody and Suzanne both say 25, and that is correct, right? You're going to have 25 there. As a note, we're dealing only with minimum, so in reality, they could have 24 here if they made this 51, right? So there's nothing that says you can't go above those minimums, so you can have more unduplicated volunteers than you need to in your performance measures. And if that's if that's something that you can do, we encourage that because it gives a more robust story of service. It gives us a better idea of what's going on and allows us to communicate that to our stakeholders in Congress or the executive branch, so you can go above it. And also you can go above the total number of unduplicated volunteers for your service area, right? So you could even actually have 51 up here in this work plan and still have this down here at 25. That would be okay too, because these are minimums. Again, these are minimums. So that's how you put all these pieces together. Again, we don't know how many volunteers they could put in this number of total volunteers. It just depends on who is showing up in multiple work plans that's also taking part in this. As you can see, we don't ask for a lot of the information in our other community priorities work plan that we do for the National Performance Measure work plans. Okay, let's pause and take some questions. That's a lot of information. That is sort of the formal presentation here today, but there is some more, we're going to do a little bit of a review here. But before we put these polling questions up where we do a review, I just want to pause and see what questions we have in the audience that we haven't answered yet. While we wait for some to come in, LSI team, why don't we go ahead and pull over our first poll. This is just a review question, just to check and see how well we're tracking the things that we discussed here today. True or false? All RSVPs must use the exact same output and outcome measures all across the country. True or false? Go ahead and answer that. Okay, so it looks like most of us are tracking there. False is the correct answer. I can see how you would get to true, though, because you are going to select from a menu, right? So you're going to select from a menu of many outcome and output measures. So there is a limited set, so in that way, there will be some consistency. But you are free to choose the ones that reflect your activities specifically. Got a couple of questions here. Robert asks, other community priorities, please mention the limits. Robert, the only limit that's coming to mind for me right now is that upper limit on the number of unduplicated volunteers that you can program into that space, right? So you can only program the number of unduplicated volunteers in there that after you have filled the amount that has to go into your national performance measures. And that's why we have that three-step process where we recommend allocating your national performance measures volunteers first. If there's something else on your mind, Robert, please go ahead and let us know. Marge says, can you explain the outcome for capacity building donation management? So yes and no, Marge. I won't necessarily be able to speak in depth about every one of our outputs and outcomes, but what I'll do is I'm going to navigate to our documentation about that. So we're going to go back to our home page. Check out our performance measure instructions, right? This is where we'll get that in-depth information. Just in case that went by too quickly, right? I'm going through our performance measures. And the question was specifically about donation management, so I'm just going to do a quick Control F here. Right? So we see that I've got a selection of multiple outputs that I can choose for donation management. And then one outcome, number of organizations that increase their efficiency, effectiveness, or program reach. So I've got a menu of outputs and one outcome to choose from. And what I can do if I want to learn more about these, let's say this one seems to be the one that is most directly about donations. If I want to learn more about that, I'm going to jump down farther into the document into capacity building. To save some time here, I'm just going to type in that code. You can see all the performance measures have specific codes, unique identifiers, you could say. And now I'm down here in the capacity building section. And you can see it provides some more information here. So this is where you would go to learn more about that specific outcome, if that's what you were interested in. And you can see there's parallel information about the different, that specific output, if that's what you were interested in. And you can see there's parallel information about the outcome as well. So this is the information we have about those things. And what you will apply, and you can see they do give you a lot of freedom. So by and large, we're not telling you, here's specifically how to measure this. Here's the survey that you'll use, for example. Here's the number of times that you'll use it. Here's the way to get it back from your stations or your other community partners, right? We provide these big, broad guidelines for you all to innovate and localize within. Okay, let's see. Robert says limitations on where you can go for programs, I think relating to the other community priorities. Robert, I apologize, I'm still not totally following exactly what you're mentioning. The only limit on other community priorities, again, that we have built into this application is based on the number of unduplicated volunteers that you must put into national performance measures. Don't see any other unanswered questions. So LSI, let's go ahead and pull our second little knowledge check poll up. This one's got a little bit of a longer scenario. Hollenshed Community Action Program is applying for a service area with a maximum amount of funding available of $178,000 and 220 total unduplicated volunteers. So that's what we see in Appendix A. Hollenshed County, let's say, $178,000, 220 unduplicated volunteers. How many unduplicated volunteers total must it include in its work plans? How many total must it include in its work plans? And this counts, by the way, other community priorities as a work plan, right? This counts that as a kind of work plan. This counts other community priorities as a kind of work plan. Okay, the correct answer is 220, right? They're applying for 220 total unduplicated volunteers. We need to see those 220 unduplicated volunteers somewhere. They could be, some of them, a number of them could be in that other community priorities work plan, but they need to be in there somewhere. LSI, let's go ahead and get the second question up. Or sorry, the third now. We're on our third knowledge check question. Still happy to take other questions in the chat box. I haven't seen any that I haven't addressed, but please remind me. Okay, now, how many unduplicated, the same setup, you don't need to read that again if you remember the prior setup, same setup. How many unduplicated volunteers must it include in work plans that tie to national performance measure outputs and outcomes? All right, and as the answers come in, that's 178, right? That's where that 178 comes in. Those work plans tied to outputs and outcomes, right? That's what the 178, that's the 178,000 divided by 1,000. So 178 unduplicated volunteers in national performance measure work plans, but maybe up to 220 in all, including other community priorities. And LSI team, let's go ahead and jump to the fifth knowledge check question. We kind of already talked about the fourth one just in doing some of that math. So let's go ahead and jump to our fifth and final knowledge check question here. You should choose your output and outcome targets based on A, what you think is a big enough number for CNCS, B, an assumption that you'll reach everyone in the community and that the program will have its intended effects on 100% of its recipients, or C, a realistic estimate of how many people you can expect to reach and the realistic impact of the program on those people, informed by ... or finally, D, a dartboard. Which of those do you think is the best way to choose your output and outcome targets? We had one, we've got somebody in the audience out there mentioning a dartboard. You're free to do that, I suppose, in your application, but what happens next is up to you. You're free to do that in your application, but what comes next is up to you. Okay, it looks like we're tracking there, right? We are really looking for your best estimate of what you expect to achieve, informed by those community partnerships and your own research as you enter a grant year. Do we have any other questions? I haven't seen any other questions come in that chat box. LSI team, thanks for that. Let's go ahead and pull that down. I do want to just jump back and bring our training schedule back up here. Just a reminder, if some of what I've said sounds a little bit like gibberish today, because I didn't go over all the basics, I didn't explain every word in a lot of depth, please do come back for other training opportunities or view the recordings. Let me do one last call for questions before we sign off. As I do that, I see we have a question from Sylvia. Also, LSI team, why don't you go ahead and pull up our satisfaction surveys right now. You'll see two very brief satisfaction questions pop up on your screen. Please take a second to answer them before you sign off. Let us know how we're doing. Helps us continue to improve. Make sure we get you the information that you're looking for. Sylvia says a question about SAM. my good friend Sam, Uncle Sam, no, I think I know what Sylvia is talking about. That is the System for Award Management. It is a federal system, government-wide, that is referred to in the Notice of Funding application. The most important thing to know about that is you do need to have an active registration with it. Sylvia asks, can the director apply with SAM for username and password, or does it have to be the sponsor? That is actually a question I don't know the exact answer to, because that's a lot about SAM's requirements. So I can't tell you exactly what SAM requires from individual organizations. So I'll just have to point you back to some of the information that's in the Notice of Funding Opportunity about SAM itself. The sponsor is the organization that has to be registered, right? The organization that is serving as the legal applicant, that has a legal responsibility, is what has to be registered, and it is an organization-wide registration in SAM, right? So you register organizations. Now, I unfortunately can't speak to the individual person within the organization that must get that process started. Mary asks, for those doing evidence-based programming, are outcomes required? I ask because outcomes for evidence-based programs are known. So yes, Mary, even if you're implementing an evidence-based program, you must use National Performance Measure outcomes. Some of you who've worked with Senior Corps in the past know that that hasn't always been the case, but it is now. In simplifying work plans, we had to kind of streamline things a little bit, and that is one simplification. So all work plans that are not other community priorities will have outputs and outcomes. So you do still need to measure those. You do still need to measure those. Hopefully, though, you'll be able to project those numbers with greater confidence. You'll be able to simplify your measuring system because those programs have that level of evidence behind them, have that vetted infrastructure to support them. Okay, I don't see any other unanswered questions. So with that, I will go ahead and sign off. Again, if you haven't filled out the poll, please, the 2 polls that you see on your screen, please do. We really appreciate that. And I will just wish you all good luck with your applications. I hope to see some of you back here for Thursday for the last in our first series of 5 webinars. It's always a pleasure, everybody. Thank you again for your time and for learning.